The fog had settled over Holstead County like a lid no one dared lift. It clung to the pines, curled beneath porch lights, and swallowed the sound of tires on asphalt hole. You could drive a full mile down a road you had traveled 1,000 times and still miss your own childhood home. That was the thing about this place. Memory had a way of vanishing here, quietly, without protest, without so much as a whisper goodbye. It was just past 7 in the morning on May 5th, 2025, when the call came through. Deputy Sheriff Lana Whitaker had barely poured her first coffee when the dispatch crackled to life on the counter beside the toaster. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, careful in the way people are when they know the weight of what they are about to say. Possible discovery out by Morning Lake Pines. Construction team digging for a septic tank has unearthed what they believe is a school bus. Plates match a long closed case. Lana stood frozen in the silence of her kitchen for a long moment. The mug warmed her palm. Her other hand reached instinctively for the notepad she always kept near the toaster, but she didn't pick it up. She didn't need to write it down. She knew this case by heart, had known it by heart for 39 years. 15 children, 1 bus driver, vanished in 1986. They were students from Holstead Ridge Elementary, her school, her grade, her classmates. She had been homesick that day, chickenpox, and for nearly 4 decades she had carried that small, strange guilt like a splinter lodged somewhere beneath her skin. The kind of splinter you stop noticing until someone presses on exactly the right spot. She slid the untouched coffee into the sink, grabbed her keys, and left the house without locking the door. The drive to Morning Lake was slow and quiet. The fog dulled sound and stretched time into something elastic and unreliable. Pines rose on either side of the narrow 2-lane road like patient sentinels standing watch over a secret they had agreed long ago never to tell. Lana passed the old ranger station, abandoned now, its windows dark and empty as eyes, and turned onto the overgrown service road that had once led to the summer nature camp the children had been heading for on that final morning in May. She remembered how excited they had all been. The last field trip before summer break. A lake, a fire pit, new cabins built by volunteers over the winter. She remembered the photographs in the yearbook, smiling faces pressed against bus windows, kids with Walkmans and cartoon backpacks and disposable cameras, already composing the memories they would carry home. She had been jealous, lying in her bed with a fever, listening to the neighborhood go quiet as the bus pulled away. She had never stopped thinking about that morning. When she arrived at the dig site, the construction crew had already established a perimeter. The yellow of the bus was visible in patches beneath the mud, dull, cracked, half-crushed under the weight of nearly 4 decades of earth pressing down on it with patient, relentless indifference. A backhoe stood motionless beside the exposed side of the vehicle, frozen mid-motion like a guilty creature that had just uncovered something it hadn't meant to find. The site foreman met her at the edge of the cleared ground, removing his hard hat with a quiet respect that told her everything about what kind of man he was. "We didn't touch anything once we saw what it was," he said. "You'll want to see this?" Lana nodded, her throat too tight to speak. They had cleared enough earth from one side of the vehicle to pry open the emergency exit door. A sour, earthy smell drifted outward. Mildew, decay, the particular scent of time compressed into a sealed space. Inside, the seats were still in place. Some of the seat belts were latched. A pink lunchbox sat on the floor beneath the 3rd row, exactly where a 9-year-old would have tucked it before pressing her face to the window for one last look at home. A child's shoe lay on the back step, covered in dried moss. But there were no bodies. The bus was empty. That made it worse, somehow. A hollow monument. a question mark buried in 39 years of dirt and silence. Lana stepped inside, her boots creaking on the warped floor, the air pressing against her like something that had been waiting a long time for someone to open the door. At the front of the bus, taped to the dashboard, barely faded, as though time itself had chosen to spare this one detail, was a class list. Written in the looping, cheerful handwriting of Miss Delaney, the homeroom teacher who had vanished with them. 15 names, ages 9 to 11. And at the bottom, in a different hand, darker, rougher, written over the top in red marker, a single sentence that stopped Lana's breath cold in her chest. We never made it to Morning Lake. She stepped back out of the bus. The air felt colder now. Somewhere behind her, a bird called out. But it sounded less like a greeting and more like a warning. She turned to the site foreman, her voice flat and controlled and professional. "Seal off the area," she said. "No one touches anything else until the state team gets here." She looked back at the bus one last time, framed by pines and silence, and the strange weight of an unanswered question that had aged alongside her for 39 years. They were supposed to be gone for 2 days. Instead, they never came back. But someone had been here long enough to write that note. Someone had pressed a red marker to a piece of paper and left behind a message for whoever would eventually come looking. And now, 4 decades later, Lana Whitaker had come looking. The old Holstead County Records building smelled of mildew and lemon cleaner, its ceiling fans spinning with the lazy indifference of machinery that had long since given up trying to make a difference. Lana stood at the counter, her fingers drumming on the wood, while the clerk retrieved the case box from the archives with the careful, two-handed reverence of someone handling something that might fall apart if treated unkindly. Field Trip 6B, Holstead Ridge Elementary, May 19, 1986. Sealed after 5 years, no updates. The box held photographs of the children, school portraits mostly, the kind where the backdrop is a swirl of blue, and the subject is told to smile, but looks instead like they are trying to remember something. Xeroxed class rosters. A list of personal items reportedly packed for the trip, and at the very bottom, a report stamped in red ink that had faded to the color of old rust. Missing persons, presumed lost. No evidence of foul play. That stamp had haunted this town for decades. No evidence, no foul play, no children. Lana had always suspected there was more. So had everyone else, but suspicion without evidence is just a ghost, and Holstead County had learned to live with its ghosts. The bus driver's name had been Carl Davis, part-time employee, recently hired, barely vetted. He had no wife, no children, and had reportedly vanished in the days following the disappearance. He was never found. The substitute teacher, Miss Delaney, had been sick that week, replaced at the last moment by a woman listed in the records only as M. Atwell, had given an address that turned out to be an overgrown lot on the edge of town. She had never been seen again either. Lana stared at the photocopied class photograph for a long time. She still knew their names, still knew the specific weight of each face in her memory. She traced a finger over one face in particular. Nora Kelly. Wide green eyes. A missing front tooth. A pink ribbon tied carefully in her hair by someone who had loved her enough that morning to make sure it sat straight. Nora had lived 2 houses down from Lana. They had shared popsicles on the curb every summer, their feet bare on the hot pavement, talking about nothing in the comfortable, unhurried way that children talk when they believe the future is infinite. A knock at the doorframe snapped her back. Deputy Harris stood in the doorway, eyes wide with the particular expression of someone who has just encountered something that has rearranged their understanding of the world. "Sheriff," he said, "you need to see this." They were at the hospital 15 minutes later. A woman had been found by a fishing couple half a mile from the dig site, wandering barefoot through the undergrowth. She was dressed in tattered clothing that didn't match any local brands, the kind of clothes that looked as though they had been worn and repaired and worn again for a very long time. She was dehydrated, malnourished, and barely conscious, but she was alive. The nurse who met Lana outside the exam room spoke carefully, in the measured tone of someone who has learned that certain pieces of information require handling. She's stable. No ID mid-30s. She keeps saying she's 12 years old. A pause. We thought it was trauma until she gave us her name. The nurse handed Lana a clipboard. Scrolled across the top in trembling handwriting was a name that hit Lana somewhere below the sternum, in the soft place where old grief lives. Nora Kelly. Lana's knees nearly buckled. She says she was on a school field trip, the nurse added quietly, and that she's been trying to get home ever since. The woman inside the room sat up slowly when Lana entered. Her hair was long and tangled, her face drawn and pale, mapped with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding on for a very long time. But the eyes were unmistakable, green, wide, exactly as they had been in every photograph, in every memory, in every sleepless night Lana had spent over the past 4 decades wondering. Lana stopped at the foot of the bed. Nora. The woman blinked. Her eyes welled up. A tear slid down her cheek. "You got old," she whispered. Lana felt her throat close completely. She walked slowly to the chair beside the bed and sat, too stunned to do anything but be present in the impossible reality of the moment. "You remember me?" she finally managed. Nora nodded. "You had chicken pox. You were supposed to come too." Tears burned in Lana's eyes. The 39 years between them collapsed like paper. "They told me no one would remember," Nora whispered, "that no one would come." "Who told you that?" Lana asked gently. Nora looked past her, out the window at the gray afternoon sky. Then she turned back, her voice dropping to something barely above a breath. "We never made it to Morning Lake." By 9 that evening, Lana was back at the hospital. The doctors had completed their initial evaluations. No signs of injury beyond sun exposure, dehydration, and the kind of psychological trauma that doesn't have a clean clinical name, the trauma of duration, of prolonged displacement from everything a person once knew as solid and real. Nora had been moved to a quieter wing. When Lana entered, she found her curled beneath a blanket, staring at a small paper cup of water on the tray as though it were the most remarkable object she had ever encountered. "Can I ask you something?" Lana said softly. Nora looked up. "Do you believe me?" "I do," Lana said. A sad smile crossed Nora's face. "Most don't." Lana pulled her chair closer. "Do you remember the bus ride?" Nora looked down at her hands. "Only the beginning. The driver didn't talk much. He wasn't our usual guy." She paused, something shifting behind her eyes. "And there was someone else. A man. Waiting by the fork in the road." Lana leaned forward carefully, the way you approach something fragile. "Do you remember what he looked like?" "Not really. I think he had a beard. I just remember what he said." "What did he say?" Nora's voice dropped. "He said the lake wasn't ready for us yet, that we'd have to wait." The chill moved up Lana's arm slowly, like something being poured. "He got on the bus," Nora continued. "And then, I don't know. I woke up in a barn. But it wasn't a barn anymore, it was like a home, except the windows were all covered and the clocks were wrong." "Wrong how?" "They always said it was Tuesday, even when it wasn't. They wouldn't let us talk about before, we had to use new names." She swallowed. "There were 2 of them at first, a woman and the man. She called him Mr. Avery. I don't know if that was his real name. She disappeared after a few months. I think she got sick." Do you know where the barn was? Nora shook her head slowly. They moved us around, sometimes in vans. We weren't allowed to look outside. They said people had forgotten about us, that it was better this way. Her voice cracked at the edges. Some of the others, after a while, they forgot about school, about home. They stopped asking to go back. Lana sat in the silence that followed, letting it hold the weight of what had just been said. But you didn't forget, she said finally. I never did, Nora said, not once. Lana reached into her coat pocket and placed something on the tray between them. A faded yearbook photograph, the same one she had been staring at all day. Nora picked it up. Her fingers trembled. She stared at the small grid of faces for a long moment, then touched one with her fingertip. That's me, she whispered, and that's Caleb and Marcy. She stopped. Her eyes filled. You kept this? I never stopped, Lana said. Nora clutched the photograph to her chest the way a person holds on to something they had given up believing they would ever find again. That night, Lana sat alone in her truck outside the old Holstead barn on County Line Road, the engine off, the dark pressing in around her from all sides. Something Nora had said kept circling back. The clocks were wrong. They always said it was Tuesday. And the name, Avery, Mr. Avery. She ran it through the county database. Frank Avery had owned this barn. He had died in 2003, leaving behind a son, Martin Avery, whose last known address was listed as unknown. No current employment record. No tax filings after 2007. A ghost in the system, or a man who had learned to move through the world without leaving footprints. She stepped out of the truck and stood in the moonlight, studying the silhouette of the barn against the dark sky. Something glinted near the base of the wall as her flashlight swept the ground. She crouched and found it tangled in a clump of weeds, a bracelet. Plastic, faded purple, etched with a child's name in blocky, careful handwriting. K-I-M-I. Lana's breath caught. Kim Leong, one of the 15. A quiet, artistic girl who had loved dinosaurs and cartoons and had written her name on absolutely everything. Her lunchbox, her pencil case, her shoes. Lana had seen her handwriting in the yearbook, in the careful block letters of a child who understood that things needed to be marked to be remembered. She stood slowly, her heart loud in her chest. The bracelet was still in her hand when she returned to the station just after midnight. She placed it beside the class photograph and lined it up with the face of Kim Leong, 10 years old, glasses, a dinosaur patch on her backpack. The past wasn't just whispering anymore. It was screaming. By sunrise, the dig site at Morning Lake was buzzing with the quiet urgency of people who understand that what they are doing matters. The forensic team had cleared more earth from around the bus, and within the first hour of the new day, one of the investigators called out from inside the vehicle. Sheriff, you're going to want to see this. She walked over. The investigator held a sealed evidence sleeve carefully, almost reverently. Inside was a photograph. Color, slightly curled at the edges, but not aged the way it should have been for something buried nearly 4 decades. Where was it? Wedged behind the metal paneling above the back left window. Looked recently placed, honestly. Lana took the photograph and studied it. It showed a group of children, 8 or 9 of them, standing in front of a low wooden building. A barn, perhaps, or a lodge. The siding was weathered, the windows boarded. The children's expressions were uniformly blank. Not frightened, not smiling. Just absent, like something essential had been switched off behind their eyes. Several of the faces were unmistakable. Marcy, Caleb, and there in the center, Nora. Her green eyes wide and vacant, looking directly at the camera with the expression of someone who no longer quite believed in the reality of the lens pointed at them. But what made Lana's stomach drop was in the background. Barely visible in the shadows of the doorway behind the children stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, face mostly obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. His posture was that of someone who was accustomed to having people arrange themselves for his approval. She flipped the photograph over. 4 words, written in careful block letters on the back. The Chosen. Year 2. No date, no location, just those words. Year 2. Which meant the children had been held for longer than anyone had yet dared to say out loud. Back at the station, Lana spread everything across the table. The photograph, the bracelet, the class list from the dashboard, the note written in red marker, the fragments of Nora's account, assembled into a rough timeline in her notebook. She opened a county map and began cross-referencing every Avery-owned property, every abandoned building, every decommissioned facility within a 50-mile radius of the dig site. She moved through the list methodically, eliminating one name at a time, until one entry stopped her cold. Riverview Camp. An old summer retreat for children, purchased in 1984 by a private family trust. The land records had been scrubbed of identifying information sometime in the late 1980s. The property had remained off-grid since the early 90s. It sat at the edge of the national forest, 30 miles from the bus site, bounded on one side by a river and on the other by a ridge of dense pine. She circled it in red ink. That afternoon, she brought the photograph to Nora. The moment the image touched her hands, Nora gasped. Her fingers trembled against the edges of it, as though the photograph itself carried a physical charge. "This was after the first winter," she said softly. "We were made to pose once a season. To show progress, they called it." She looked up, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. "That building, that's where they kept us the longest. Do you know where it is?" Nora shook her head. "We weren't allowed outside without blindfolds, but I remember sounds. A river, a train whistle at sunset, and the air always smelled like burning pine." The pieces clicked together with the quiet precision of a lock turning. Riverview Camp was named for its position at a bend in the river, and there had once been a logging train that ran through that section of the national forest. Its whistle had echoed for miles at dusk, a sound so regular that the locals had used it to set their watches. The line had been decommissioned in 1994, but the tracks were still there, rusting quietly in the undergrowth. Lana pointed to the figure in the doorway of the photograph. "Do you recognize this man?" Nora hesitated. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's not Mr. Avery," she whispered. "Then who is it? That's someone worse." A long pause. They called him Father Elijah, but he wasn't a priest. He just liked the sound of it. "What happened to him?" Nora stared at the photograph. He just stopped coming. "After year 3, then we were moved again, different place, different rules." Her voice cracked. "Some didn't make it. Some forgot their own names." Lana placed a gentle hand on Nora's. "You didn't forget?" "No," Nora said. "I didn't." That night, Lana drove north. The road narrowed to gravel as she climbed toward the national forest, and the trees thickened on either side until they formed walls of absolute dark on either side of her headlights. Fog gathered low on the ground, curling between roots and old fence posts. Halfway up the access road, a faded wooden sign emerged from the undergrowth on her right, half swallowed by vines. Riverview Youth Retreat. Private land. She parked at the edge of the old property line and stepped out into a silence so complete it felt deliberate. No birds, no wind in the branches, just the low, distant sound of moving water. She followed the overgrown path with a flashlight, stepping over roots and around sections where the ground had gone soft. And then, halfway down the trail, she saw it. The building from the photograph. The roof had sagged inward at one end. The porch was rotted through, but the walls were unmistakably the same weathered siding, the same blackened corners, the same boarded windows that had become such a constant backdrop to the children's posed photographs that they had stopped noticing them. She approached slowly, testing each porch board before committing her weight to it. Just before she reached the door, she froze. In the dirt at the base of the steps, fresh footprints, small ones, the size of a child's shoe. Lana's hand moved instinctively to her sidearm. "Hello?" she called out. "Anyone here?" Silence. And then, from somewhere inside the building, barely audible, barely there, a whisper. "You're not supposed to be here." Then a second voice, softer, almost playful. She came anyway. The door was cracked open. Lana pushed it with her foot and stepped inside. Her beam swept across bare walls, dust-choked air, the skeletal remains of furniture abandoned so long ago that the wood had begun to return to its original state. But what caught her eye first, what stopped her in the center of the room, was what had been carved into the far wall. Names. Dozens of them. Some scratched shallow and fast, as if rushed. Others carved deep and deliberate. The kind of carving that takes hours, that requires a kind of determination most people never have to call upon. Names carved again and again, layered over each other in a palimpsest of desperate repetition. Kimmy, Marcy, Elijah, crossed out, Caleb, Sam, question mark, Nora, 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 3 times, one below the other. This wasn't a hiding place, it had been a prison, and the prisoners had done the only thing available to them. They had written their names into the walls because they understood, at some essential level, that a name written in stone is harder to erase than a name written only in memory. Beneath a collapsed table in the corner, she found a metal box, rusted at the edges but intact. She pried it open. Inside, a thin stack of Polaroids, bound with a rubber band. The photographs were candid, taken from odd angles, the kind that made them feel immediately and viscerally wrong. Children sleeping. Children eating. One child crying in the corner of a narrow, windowless room. On the back of each photograph, a name, but not their real names. Dove, Glory, Silence, Obedience. The last photograph was different. A child standing alone by a tree, face turned away. Her left arm was visible, and on her wrist, unmistakably, a purple plastic bracelet. The same kind Lana had found tangled in the weeds at the Avery barn. She flipped it over. One word written on the back. Disobeyed. A soft creak sounded behind her. Lana stood quickly, her flashlight cutting across the room. "Hello," she said, keeping her voice steady and calm. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm here to help." Silence. And then, from the top of the stairs, barely audible in the dark, a child's voice. "You're not like them." She climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the wall for balance, the old wood groaning beneath each step. At the top of the landing, one door at the end of the hall stood slightly ajar. A faint flicker of candlelight pulsed through the gap. She moved toward it. Inside, the air was warmer. Someone had been here recently. The candle was fresh, the wax still liquid at the edges. The walls were covered in drawings, charcoal and pencil, crude but deliberate, the work of a hand that had been doing this for a long time. A line of children walking through woods, a man with no face, arms stretched wide, a school bus in flames, and below the bus a row of small identical headstones. "They told us not to draw," a voice said from the doorway. "But we did anyway." She turned. A boy, no older than 10. barefoot, standing in the doorframe with dark eyes that held a stillness entirely inconsistent with his age. Hair unwashed, cheeks pale and hollow, dirt smudged across one side of his face. He stood with his arms at his sides, watching her with the careful, calibrated assessment of a child who has learned to read adults quickly and accurately. "Who are you?" Lana asked, lowering the flashlight so it didn't shine in his eyes. "They called me Jonah," he said, "but that wasn't my name. Do you remember your real name?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "They took it." "That's okay," Lana said. "You don't have to remember it right now. Are you here to take me away?" "I'm here to help." The boy considered this for a moment with the gravity of someone weighing something important. Then he pointed past her, toward the wall behind the old metal bunk beds. Lana turned and followed his gaze. Etched faintly into the floorboards, nearly hidden beneath a layer of dust, were more names. But these hadn't been carved by hand. They had been burned into the wood, scorched into permanence by something she couldn't immediately explain. The wood around each letter was darkened, as if the act of writing them had required an intensity that left a mark on the world. Beneath the names, in black ink, names we must not forget. 12 names, 3 circled, the rest crossed out. Lana sat with the boy in the back of her vehicle, wrapped in a heavy blanket, the emergency thermal foil crinkling softly with each small movement he made. He didn't ask where they were going. He didn't ask why she had come. He stared out the window with the gray, distant eyes of someone who has grown accustomed to a world that moves without consulting him. Only one question seemed to matter. Are the others coming back too? Lana didn't answer. She didn't know yet, but she was going to find out. The forensics team called in a second discovery the following morning. Another photograph, recovered from beneath the rear floor panel of the bus, partially burned at one edge, as though someone had tried to destroy it and then change their mind or run out of time. It showed 4 children seated around a campfire. One of them, facing the camera directly, had a calm and deliberate expression, the expression of someone who had made a decision and was at peace with it. In the bottom corner, written in black marker, he stayed. He chose to stay. Lana pulled up the old roster and moved through the names one by one until she stopped at one. Aaron Devlin, age 11 at the time of the trip. Quiet, gifted, a chess player, a reader. Always working through books 3 or 4 grade levels ahead of where the curriculum required him to be. She checked the county database. An A. Devlin was listed in the town's electrical department. Age 49. No high school record on file prior to 1990. Moved to Holstead in 2004. Lived alone in a trailer at the edge of town. No listed next of kin. She didn't believe in coincidences anymore. The trailer sat at the end of a gravel lot, half buried in pine needles, the door rusting quietly at the hinges. A single bulb above the porch flickered as Lana pulled up. She knocked once. No answer. She knocked again. "I knew someone would come eventually," a voice said from inside. The door opened. The man who stood there looked older than his years. Gray at the temples, eyes sharp and still and unreadable in the way of someone who has spent a long time watching and very little time being watched. He stood perfectly still in the doorframe, with the posture of someone accustomed to waiting for judgment. "Aaron Devlin." He nodded once. "I remember you," he said softly. "You used to wear braids, jean jacket with patches." Lana blinked. "You remember me?" "Same class. You had a green backpack with a silver zipper that always got stuck." Her heart skipped a full beat. "Why didn't you come forward?" Aaron stepped aside to let her in. Because not everyone wanted to leave. Inside the trailer, everything was meticulously clean and spare. A chessboard on the coffee table, mid-game, bookshelves lining every available wall, psychology, memory, group behavior, the mechanics of belief, and the dissolution of identity. The library of a man who has spent decades trying to understand something that happened to him before he had the vocabulary to name it. I left the sanctuary in 1991, Aaron said, settling carefully on the edge of the couch. I was 16. They let me go. Let you go? I was the one who stayed when others tried to escape, the one who helped maintain order. I believed in it for a long time. I thought it was safety. He looked at his hands. But then things changed. After year 4, the group splintered. Elijah disappeared. The others started to rebel. Marcy ran. Caleb tried to fight back. His voice was very quiet. I stayed. Not because I agreed, because I was terrified of the outside, because they had told me so many times that the world had moved on without us that I had begun to believe it. He looked at her. When I finally left, I didn't know how to be anything other than quiet. I got a job, paid my taxes, tried not to exist too loudly. He paused. If you're here, someone must have come back. Nora, Lana said. Aaron's eyes flickered. Something moved across his face. Grief, maybe, or the particular relief of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down. She remembered, he whispered. After all this time. He stood, walked to the window. Stood there for a moment with his back to her, looking out at the darkening tree line. I know where the others might be, he said, at least where they were sent after the fires. What fires? He turned back. His hands were clenched at his sides. There was an uprising. The older ones, some of them set part of the sanctuary ablaze. The group scattered. The younger ones were moved, split up, hidden under new names in different locations. He crossed the room and pulled on his jacket. They buried the truth in the woods. But I can take you there. The forest felt different at night. Not wild or free, but watchful, as though every tree remembered what had been done in its shadow and had been keeping the secret ever since. Each step Lana took on the narrow trail stirred the silence like dust. Aaron walked ahead without speaking, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the path. He hadn't said a word in the last mile, just walked with a quiet urgency that was more than enough to communicate everything that needed communicating. They reached a small clearing just past the first ridge. Surrounded by towering pines, a half-collapsed structure leaned against the hillside with the exhausted dignity of something that had been asked to hold itself upright for far too long. The roof had caved in on one side. Vines twisted up through the wooden frame, nature quietly reclaiming what it had been denied. This was the original sanctuary, Aaron said. The first site. The place we were taken after the bus was diverted. It used to be bigger. 4 cabins, a lodge, 2 underground cells. Cells? They called them reflection rooms. He paused. They were pits, no light, no sound except your own thoughts, until your own thoughts stopped making sense. They put children in there, Marcy, Kimmy, Nora once, for saying the word school. His voice cracked and steadied. I let it happen. I believed it was the only way we would survive. Inside the ruins, in one corner shielded beneath a collapsed beam, stood a set of 3 small lockers, rusted but intact. Aaron joined her beside them. These were ours, he said. They allowed us nothing. Blank books, uniforms, 1 spoon each, but some of us hid pieces of who we used to be. The first locker was empty. The second held only a torn shoe and a melted crayon. But the third contained something wrapped in cloth. She opened it. Inside, a cracked cassette player, a child's bracelet, and a drawing, carefully preserved in plastic wrap, the paper still white enough to read. It showed a girl standing on a hill beneath a full moon. She wore a red ribbon in her hair. In her hand was a sign, and on the sign 3 words written in a child's careful block letters. "We are still here." Lana knelt on the floor of the ruined sanctuary with the drawing in her lap. It wasn't a plea, it was a declaration. The drawing of a child who understood, at some essential level, that the act of saying "I exist" is the first and most fundamental form of resistance. "Aaron," she said quietly, "where did they take the younger ones when the fire came?" He pointed toward the ridge behind the old structure. "There's a second trail. Hidden. That's where they moved the ones too young to run." A pause. They didn't call it a sanctuary anymore. What did they call it? His eyes darkened. Haven. The concrete structure was built into the hillside, partially camouflaged by moss and age and the particular invisibility of things that have been forgotten long enough. No signs, no markings, no path leading to it. Only a steel door, rusted at its hinges, set into the earth as though the earth itself had been trying to swallow it. Aaron stood before it with his palm flat against the cold metal. This was where they took the ones too young to question, or the ones too broken to resist. It was quieter here, colder. He removed his hand. They didn't teach anymore, they just observed. They called it watching the fruit ripen. For what? Full obedience, complete forgetting. They pried the door open with an emergency jack from Lana's truck. The air that poured out was damp and still, tinged with mildew and something faintly metallic that she couldn't name. Her flashlight swept across cement floors, water-stained walls, broken furniture. Scratches covered every surface, names, symbols, short messages etched with fingernails or keys, or anything else available to a child who had nothing but time and the desperate human need to leave a mark. To the right, a small door. A plaque hung crookedly above it, the single word on it rubbed to near illegibility but still readable. Garden. The garden was not a room, it was a void. Close walls, a low ceiling. Air so still it felt geological. No furniture, no windows, no sound except the faint drip of water somewhere in the dark. The walls were covered in tally marks, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, scratched in careful sequence by hands that were counting something. Days, punishments, the distance between now and before. In the far corner, half buried under dust and broken plaster, her beam caught the edge of something small and rectangular. She knelt and brushed it free. A cassette recorder. Battered and old, the tape inside nearly disintegrated, etched into the plastic casing with a pin or nail, in letters too small to read without squinting, for the ones who remember. She slipped it into an evidence bag. Her hand was not entirely steady, because this was not a relic left behind for curiosity. This was a message, pressed into the last available surface by someone who understood that a message requires a messenger, and who had refused to leave without leaving something behind. It took the tech team the better part of a day to restore the cassette. The tape was fragile enough that it could only be played once, a single pass through the machine, after which it would deteriorate beyond recovery. Lana asked to be alone for the playback. The lights in the station were low. Rain had begun tapping against the windows in a soft, persistent rhythm. She sat at her desk, the recorder before her, and pressed play. Static. Then a voice. Small. Weak. The voice of someone who has been using only whispers for so long that full volume has begun to feel dangerous. "This is Nora, I think. I don't know anymore. It's dark. I can't tell how long I've been here, but I think I remember school. I think I had a brother." Lana sat forward. "They don't let us say real names. They say that's how the world finds you. But I write them anyway, even if it's just in my head. A long pause, the sound of breathing. If anyone finds this, don't believe them when they say we ran away. We didn't. We were taken. We were made into something else. Another pause, then softer. But I'm not gone, not yet. The tape clicked to silence. Lana sat very still for a moment. Then she pulled up the old roster. She had assumed the voice was Nora's. The hesitation, the reference to school, the careful way of speaking, but the voice was younger than Nora had been when she was found. More hesitant, holding on to something with a different quality of grip. She ran through the names one by one and stopped at Kim Leung. That night, she brought the recorder to Nora's hospital room and played the tape. When the voice came through the small speaker, Nora covered her mouth. Her eyes filled immediately and completely. "I remember this," she whispered. She used to practice her voice like she wanted someone to hear it the right way, someday. She was trying to hold on. She was, Lana said. Nora reached for the recorder, then stopped herself. She looked at Lana with an expression that carried 39 years of parallel survival in it. "She's alive," Nora said. "I don't know how I know that. But I do." Lana didn't argue, because the voice on the tape hadn't sounded like someone at the end of something. It had sounded like someone waiting at the beginning of something that hadn't happened yet. The following morning, Aaron handed Lana a map drawn from memory on a piece of notebook paper. He pointed to a spot near the far end of the woods, just past the second ridge. "There's a hatch hidden in the roots of a tree that was split by lightning. They used it to move people when they didn't want to be seen. If they were smart, and they were, it's still there." The tree was a tall cedar, its trunk cleaved decades ago by a strike that had blackened one entire side and left the other ghostly pale. Beneath its roots, concealed behind brush and loose stone, was a rusted metal hatch. They forced it open. Cold air poured out like a held breath finally released. Lana led the way down. What they found below was not a single tunnel but a network. Hallways, rooms, bunks, storage crates. All abandoned but too intact for comfort. Too organized for the work of someone who had left in a hurry. The work of someone who had planned to come back. At the end of the main corridor, a door, worn and wooden, sealed tight. She knocked once. Silence. Then, from behind the door, something scraped. A footstep. She pressed her ear to the wood and heard breathing, slow and controlled, the breathing of someone who had learned long ago to be very quiet. "Hello," Lana said. "My name is Lana. I'm a sheriff. You're safe now." A long silence. Then a voice, small and cautious, and full of something that hit harder than fear. "They said we couldn't leave until someone remembered us." The door shrieked on its hinges as they pried it open. Dust poured out in thick clouds, and then the air, stale and motionless, the air of a sealed room that hadn't been breathed in a very long time. Inside, Lana's flashlight landed on a figure. Hunched, thin, layered in clothes worn one on top of another for warmth, wrapped in a tattered blanket. A woman, not a child, though the child was still visible somewhere in the structure of her face. She blinked hard against the light, shielding her eyes with one hand. "Too bright," she whispered, "too fast." Lana crouched carefully, bringing herself to the woman's level. "What's your name?" The woman trembled. She was holding something against her chest. A leather-bound notebook, its edges cracked and soft with age. "They called me Silence," she said. "But that wasn't mine. Do you remember your real name?" The woman stared at Lana for a long moment, through her almost, as though confirming something she had been waiting a very long time to confirm. Then, barely above a breath, Kimmy Leong, the girl in the Polaroids, the name on the purple bracelet, the voice on the tape. alive. At the hospital, the doctors worked in the careful, quiet way of people who understand that some kinds of damage require patience above all else. Kimmy barely spoke during the initial evaluation. Her responses were slow and deliberate, as though she were translating something from a language she had been forced to use for so long that her original one had receded. Nora sat across from her in the quiet recovery room, watching through tear-filled eyes. "You remember me?" she asked softly. Kimmy turned her head. "You had the red ribbon." Nora smiled through the ache. "You used to braid it for me." Kimmy reached out, hesitated, then placed the notebook on the bed between them like an offering. "They made me keep records," she said. "They thought I was obedient. But I wrote the truth too. In the margins, in code. Like we used to do in math class." Lana took the journal and opened to the first page. On the surface, it looked like a log of devotional exercises, passages, reflections, carefully copied mantras. But in the corners of every page, numbers, shapes, dates, and names. Caleb, taken from Sanctuary, 1988. Did not return. Marcy, escaped during fire, believed dead, not confirmed. Sam, broken during final year. Jonah, transferred. Nora, punished. Memory withheld. Me, waiting. Each entry grew darker and more fractured as the years progressed, until the final one, written in a hand that had clearly been shaking. "If someone finds this, don't just take us back. Take us forward. Help us become real again." The final tunnel wasn't on any map, but Kimmy's journal held the key. Buried in coded margins and scattered through false devotional verses, Lana pieced together a set of landmarks. 3 petrified trees. A stream that split and never rejoined. A hollow curve at the bend of the river. She followed the map at dawn. The riverbed was low from the dry season, revealing dark limestone and twisted roots. She crossed on slippery rocks until she found them. 3 large petrified trunks clustered together on a ridge, their bark turned to stone, their shapes preserved in permanent mid-gesture. Below them, just where the journal had indicated, a depression in the earth, circular, covered in moss and arranged branches. She cleared them carefully and found a steel hatch beneath, fused with age but intact, an engraving at the edge, worn nearly smooth. TS2. Transfer Station 2. Inside was not a prison. Not exactly, it was a preservation. 10 rooms, each no larger than a walk-in closet. Drawings on the walls, children's hands, stick figures holding hands, suns with sharp rays, the outline of a bus disappearing over a hill. And in the central room, larger than the others, domed at the ceiling. 15 small desks arranged in a tight circle, each one bearing a nameplate. At the center of the circle, beneath a dusty glass dome, a book. The final curriculum. Typed lessons. Handwritten notes. Margins filled with erratic repetition. Obedience is safety. Memory is danger. The past is the infection. The future is correction. And then, scattered across the final pages, a single name appearing again and again in different handwriting. Cassia, then crossed out, then written again, then this. Cassia did not forget. Cassia ran. Cassia saw what they did in Room 6. Room 6 is sealed. They found Room 6 behind a false wall. Its door had been bricked over, the brick sealed with concrete. It took hours to breach. When they finally did, the air that hit them was cold and old and absolute. Inside were photographs. Hundreds of them. Children in uniforms. Children kneeling. Children standing in rows with the blank, absent expressions of people who have been systematically taught to believe their own faces are irrelevant. And then, on the far wall, taking up the entire surface, a mural painted by hand in blue and gold. A girl running through trees. arms outstretched, face turned upward toward the light, painted with an urgency and a care that could only come from someone who understood that beauty is its own kind of evidence. Beneath the mural, in letters large enough to read from across the room, Cassia remembered. She left the light on for us. The mural haunted Lana for days. The girl running, older than the others, maybe 14 or 15, painted with a specificity that spoke of self-portrait, of someone rendering their own likeness into permanence before they disappeared. Cassia had not been a victim. She had been a witness, a record keeper. Someone who understood that truth, if it is to survive, must be embedded in surfaces more durable than memory. Lana pulled a forgotten file from the state archives. Ward transfers, 1991 to 1993. Children relocated after the collapse of 2 unlicensed group homes in Northern California. All with scrubbed medical records, redacted intake forms, and names assigned by the system rather than by family. One entry stopped her. A girl, age estimated between 13 and 15, brought in with no memory of her name. Emotionally withdrawn, physically healthy, she had refused to speak during her first year in the system. Her given name upon intake, Jane Doe, number 19. Later renamed, at her own apparent request, Maya Ellison. Adopted in 1994 by a couple in Morning Lake. Current residence, Morning Lake. Current occupation, bookseller. Lana leaned back slowly. Maya Ellison ran the bookstore on the main street of town. Quiet, kind, early 40s. Known for her extraordinary memory, she could recall customers' reading preferences from years prior. Recommend books with an accuracy that had made her something of a local legend. Lana had spoken with her dozens of times, had borrowed books, had asked her opinion on local history. Not once had she suspected a thing. She drove straight to the shop. Maya was shelving second-hand paperbacks when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up and smiled the polite, professional smile of someone who is good at being present for other people. Sheriff. Mystery section's been busy this week. Lana stepped closer. Maya. Do you know who Cassia is? The woman froze. For a long moment she stood perfectly still with a paperback in each hand, and her eyes fixed on Lana's face with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite succeeding. No. Should I? Lana placed the photograph on the counter, the mural, the girl running. Maya's hands began to tremble. The books slid from her fingers and landed softly on the floor between them. She stared at the photograph for a very long time. I used to dream about her, she said finally. I thought she was someone I had invented. A story I told myself when things were very bad. Her voice broke at the edges. She would say things I didn't understand, about names, about tunnels, about forgetting. I thought it was trauma from someone else's life. I never believed it was mine. Lana placed her hand over Maya's. It was yours, she said. You didn't just survive. You tried to leave a light on. Maya pressed her fingers to her lips. Tears filled her eyes and spilled over in the unhurried way of someone whose grief has been waiting a long time for permission to move. They told us, she whispered, that if we left, no one would believe us, that the world didn't want us. They were wrong, Lana said. You were found. On a warm spring morning, Lana Whitaker returned to Morning Lake. The sun sparkled across the surface of the water in the particular way it does at that latitude in that season, low and generous, throwing long gold lines across everything it touched. Ducks moved in slow, unhurried lines across the reflection of the pines. A light breeze moved through the grass at the water's edge. A small wooden sign stood at the end of the dock. New wood, the lettering careful and deliberate. In memory of the missing. To those who waited in silence, Your names are remembered. Lana knelt and placed a photograph beneath the sign, the one from the mural. The girl running toward the light, arms outstretched, face turned upward. Then she stood. Because Nora had moved to Seattle and was taking classes and had begun to paint again. Her first canvas was the mural from room 6, rendered in oils on a surface large enough to fill an entire wall. It's not just about surviving, she had told Lana before leaving. It's about creating something no one can take away. Because Kimmy had chosen to stay in Morning Lake and visited the lake every week and left a flower at the wooden sign and spoke aloud to the trees. Real names, all of them. Every name she had memorized in the dark. Because Maya had returned to her bookstore and now hosted workshops for young people who needed a quiet place and a voice that knew what it meant to find your way back to your own name. Because Aaron had left without a forwarding address, but had slipped a note under Lana's office door. There's more out there, other towns, other kids. I wasn't brave enough then. Maybe I can be now. And taped to the letter, a photograph of a bus. Rusted and unfamiliar. On the back, one word, Arcadia. Lana kept the letter in her desk drawer. She didn't open a new case, not yet. But sometimes at night when the wind moved through the trees outside her window and the lake was dark and the stars were out, she would think about that name. About the ones they had found and the ones they hadn't. About all the names being kept alive in all the dark places of the world by people who had refused, in the end, to forget. She would look up at the stars over Morning Lake and wonder, how many names had the world forgotten? And how many were still waiting for someone to remember?